The chapel smelled of old pine and last night's rain, the kind that clings to wooden beams and softens the light in the windows. I remember stepping inside and expecting warmth, expecting to see my children sitting in the front row, pretending not to be nervous for me. But their seats were empty, two pale wooden spaces where their bodies should have been. And in that moment, the silence didn't feel ordinary. It felt like a door closing somewhere behind me, gently but with intention, like a choice someone had already made. Ours was a mountain town where the seasons moved slowly and people moved even slower. A place where mornings carried the scent of river stone, and evenings stretched into long, thoughtful silences. I had built a life here after the divorce. Not a perfect one, but one that felt steady enough to stand on. My children stayed with me through most weeks, drifting between my home and their fathers like small, cautious tides. When I said yes to remarrying, I thought I had finally reached the far shore of something, a gentler chapter, a second beginning. But the kids stayed distant, their smiles polite, their questions short. And on the morning of the wedding, when they told me they were staying home, something in their voices trembled in a way I didn't understand. I should have listened to that tremor, but instead, I pressed my dress flat, held my bouquet a little too tightly, and walked toward a future I thought I understood. If stories like this resonate with you, quiet truths, slow-burning mystery, and the way life whispers before it shouts, feel free to subscribe to the channel. There's more to tell. I remember the light first, soft and pale, drifting through the stained glass windows like it had taken its time climbing the mountains behind the chapel. The air held the coolness of last night's rain, mixed with the faint sweetness of the old wooden pews. I stepped inside expecting to feel steadier, expecting the sight of familiar faces to ground me. But the first thing I saw was absence. Two empty seats in the front row where my children were supposed to be. Their stillness struck me harder than any sound. It felt like walking into a memory that refused to welcome me. A quiet warning I didn't yet know how to read. I tightened my grip on the bouquet, the ribbon brushing against my wrist like a reminder of how exposed I suddenly felt. The room was warm, but my skin prickled with a cold that didn't belong to the weather. Guests began turning, one by one, offering soft smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. My breath caught in my throat as if the chapel itself was asking me a question I wasn't ready to answer. I looked again at the empty seats, hoping the sight would change, but it didn't, and in that moment, I understood. Silence can be louder than any confession. The aisle felt longer than it had during rehearsal. Each step echoed faintly, growing heavier with the weight of those missing faces. I had practiced how I would walk, how I would smile, how I would meet my future with grace. But I couldn't rehearse this. The quiet ache rising in my chest, the sense that something essential had slipped through my fingers while I wasn't paying attention. When I reached the halfway point, a small gust of wind pushed through the door behind me, brushing the hem of my dress. It carried a whisper of rain and something else, something unsettled. The guests whispered among themselves, their voices blending into a muted hum. I caught fragments: traffic, maybe running late, kids their age, the small, harmless excuses people give when they don't know the truth. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to let their optimism cover the growing crack in my composure. But my children weren't late. They weren't coming. They had told me that last night in quiet, trembling voices. And as much as I wished those words had been a misunderstanding, I knew they weren't. They were a decision, one that felt older than the moment in which it was spoken. I inhaled slowly, letting the scent of damp wood fill my lungs. It should have calmed me. It didn't. Instead, something stirred inside me, a small flutter of unease, like the moment before a storm decides to break. The chapel was too quiet. Even the flickering candles near the altar seemed to hesitate, their flames leaning toward the windows as if listening for something outside. My heart beat against my ribs in a rhythm that didn't match the soft melody playing from the speakers. I took a few more steps, each one a negotiation with myself. I told my thoughts to settle, told my nerves to soften, told my heart that this moment was still supposed to be beautiful. But the deeper I walked into that chapel, the more it felt like walking into a room I didn't recognize, like stepping into someone else's story with my name written in the margins. I paused again, staring at the pew where my daughter should have been, her knee bouncing nervously, her fingers twisting the end of her cardigan. I pictured my son tapping his foot, pretending he wasn't emotional about any of this. Instead, there was only wood, only space, only the echo of what should have been. The ribbon on my bouquet brushed my palm, grounding me for a moment. I remembered how my daughter helped me choose it, how my son said it was fine, I guess, which in his language meant perfect. They hadn't fought me on the wedding. They hadn't begged me to rethink. They had simply stepped back, quietly, like shadows withdrawing from light. And now here I was, standing in front of their absence, feeling it more sharply than any presence in the room. A soft cough broke the silence behind me. Someone whispered my name, maybe out of concern, maybe out of curiosity. I kept my gaze forward, focusing on the altar, though it felt impossibly far away. The candles flickered again. One leaned so far to the side its flame stretched like a reaching hand. For a moment, I wondered if it was the draft or something else, the breath of a truth I hadn't yet faced. There was a heaviness in the air that didn't belong to celebration. It wrapped around the guests, pressed into the walls, lingered between the pews. Everyone assumed my children were simply unpredictable teenagers. That's the easy story, the comfortable one, but I knew better. Their voices from last night replayed in my mind, soft, cracked, like they were balancing on the edge of telling me more but couldn't find the words. I pushed it away then. I didn't push hard enough. My feet slowed, hesitant, as if the chapel floor remembered something I didn't. The boards creaked beneath me in a strained whisper. I felt eyes on my back, waiting for me to continue, waiting for me to smile and pretend everything was unfolding the way it should. I lifted my chin slightly, but my heart refused to follow. It stayed low, anchored somewhere in the empty space where my children's laughter should have been. The air thickened with the quiet expectation of the room. I took another step, but the unease grew heavier. It pressed against my ribs and settled behind my eyes. I blinked once, twice, trying to steady myself. The aisle seemed to breathe with me, expanding and contracting in the slow rhythm of anticipation. I stared at the empty seats one last time, and a cold certainty curled at the base of my spine. Their absence wasn't a delay. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't indifference. It was a message. And as I reached the final stretch of the aisle, a question rose in me, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, like a whisper threading through the quiet. Why does their absence feel like the beginning of something, not the end? I stopped without realizing it. One moment I was walking down the aisle, trying to hold my breath steady, and the next, something inside me froze and held me still. It felt as if the chapel itself had stretched out a quiet hand and pressed it against my shoulder. The stained glass light softened around me, dimming in color and clarity until the entire room blurred at its edges. And when I lifted my eyes toward the altar, everything inside me halted at once. Because standing there, in the exact place my future husband should have been, was the man I once loved, once married, once left behind. My ex-husband stood beside the officiant with his hands folded neatly in front of him, his posture perfectly composed. His head was slightly bowed, as though he had been waiting for some unspoken signal. For a heartbeat, I didn't recognize him. I only saw the outline of a man wearing my past like a second skin. But when he lifted his face and our eyes met, the floor beneath me seemed to tilt and settle unevenly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't confused. He looked strangely expectant, as though he had prepared himself for a moment I hadn't known existed. My breath wavered. My fingers tightened around the bouquet, until the stems bent under the pressure. A soft wave of confusion stirred through the guests as they leaned toward one another. I heard muffled whispers, rustling fabric, shifting seats. Questions rose around me like quiet echoes. Was this part of the ceremony? Was this a mistake? Had something changed last minute that nobody knew about? Their uncertainty created a tension that spread through the chapel in small, invisible ripples. I stood frozen beneath it, unable to move or speak. My cheeks warmed under the weight of everyone's eyes, but the heat didn't rise from embarrassment. It came from shock, heavy, sharp, and bewildering, because the space beside the officiant was empty, completely empty. The man I planned to marry was nowhere in sight. There should have been lilies behind him, the rings waiting at the table, maybe a nervous smile trying to hide beneath calm, but the spot meant for him was vacant, untouched, almost abandoned. My chest tightened as I scanned the doors again, half expecting him to appear with an apologetic wave. But no one entered. The doorway remained open and still, the curtain moving with the faintest breeze. Something in the air shifted, then something subtle but cold, like a draft that had slipped into the room without disturbing anything except intuition. The officiant cleared his throat in a fragile, uncertain way, breaking a silence thick enough to feel like fabric. His eyes flicked toward me, then toward the man at his side, as though he was trying to assemble a sentence he didn't want to say. He stepped outside. He finally murmured, gesturing weakly toward the back door. He said he needed to make a call. He asked him to stand here until he returned. His voice didn't match his explanation. There was a tremor hidden beneath the words, a confusion he couldn't quite hide. And the moment he finished speaking, My ex-husband's jaw tightened ever so slightly, as if bracing for something inevitable. The explanation didn't fit. It didn't make sense. My fiancé had no reason to ask this particular man to take his place, even temporarily. He knew what our past held. He understood the boundaries I had placed between my old life and my new one. He knew today mattered to me in a way I had never admitted out loud. So why would he leave? Why would he ask my ex-husband to stand where he should have been? Why would he disappear at the beginning of our future? I felt a pulse rise through my throat, heavy and uneven. Memories slipped into my mind without permission, moments from the quiet end of my first marriage. The tired conversations. The soft unraveling of two people who wanted to love each other but no longer knew how. I remembered the day we signed the divorce papers, our hands cold from winter air, our words few and gentle. There had been no dramatic ending, no shouting, just the quiet understanding that we could no longer hold each other without slipping. After that day, he had never crossed a line, never appeared where he wasn't invited. He lived his life, I lived mine. We coexisted with careful distance. So why was he standing here now? I could feel people watching me from the pews, friends, neighbors, distant relatives. Their curiosity mingled with concern, their expressions shifting as they attempted to make sense of what they were witnessing. The candles near the altar flickered, their flames bending as though responding to a draft that brushed only them. My breath thickened with unease. Something in the room felt misaligned, like a frame hanging slightly crooked on a wall. I tried to swallow the tension rising inside me, but it lodged stubbornly in my chest. My ex-husband's gaze didn't waver. If anything, he seemed to be observing the room as much as he was observing me, like someone assessing a situation he expected to shift at any moment. His expression carried a seriousness I didn't remember seeing before, a quiet, deliberate steadiness that hinted at a burden he had brought with him. It wasn't resentment, it wasn't longing, it was something else, something that made my skin prickle with an instinct I didn't understand. I felt the urge to speak, to demand clarity, to ask him what he was doing here. But the words would not form. My voice felt trapped beneath the weight of the moment. The chapel grew warmer with so many bodies inside it, yet I felt a coldness settle beneath my collarbone. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was anticipation wrapped in unease, like the air before a storm breaks open. My ex-husband stepped forward just slightly, so subtle the guests didn't notice. His hands tightened once, a small tremor in his fingers that betrayed a quiet urgency. He looked at me, not through me, not past me, but at me with an expression that held something close to warning. He parted his lips as if to speak, then paused, gathering something unspoken. Then he whispered my name, just once, quietly, waited. And in that single, fragile moment, one truth rose inside me with chilling clarity. The past didn't come to witness my future. It came carrying something I didn't know I needed to hear. When the officiant leaned slightly toward me, his voice softened into a careful whisper that seemed almost too fragile for the stillness inside. The chapel. He explained that my fiancé had stepped outside for a moment, that he needed to make a quick call, and that he had asked my ex-husband to wait at the front with them so the ceremony would not feel delayed. The explanation felt thin and hastily stitched together, the kind of story that might collapse if touched too directly. I nodded because the officiant needed some kind of response, but the motion felt disconnected from the unease gathering in the back of my throat. My eyes remained fixed on the altar, on the man standing where another should have stood, and the wrongness of the image pressed against me like a weight I could not shift. I moved forward because standing still would have drawn more attention, but every step seemed to carry me deeper into a space that did not belong to the day I had planned. The aisle runner cushioned the sound of my footsteps, yet I felt the echo of each movement inside my chest. The chapel's familiar scent of polished wood and fading flowers now carried an undercurrent of something unsettled, as if the room itself sensed a disruption it could not identify. With each step, quiet memories surfaced without invitation, not sharp enough to hurt, but precise enough to distract. I found myself remembering textures, colors, small gestures, and the slow unwinding of a past I had worked hard to fold away. A winter afternoon returned to me with unwelcome clarity. We had sat across from each other in a cramped legal office downtown, surrounded by papers we had avoided acknowledging for too long. The fluorescent lights above us hummed with a dull insistence, making every shadow on the table look deliberate and every silence feel heavier. We had discussed custody arrangements in measured tones, the alternating weekends, the holidays split down the middle, the practical unraveling of a life once shared. There had been no accusations, no declarations of regret, only the quiet fatigue of two people who had long since reached the end of their emotional map. The concrete certainty of that day still hovered inside me, faint but intact, a reminder of a goodbye that had been more administrative than heartbreaking. The memory continued as I approached the altar, my steps slow and deliberate. I remembered how we had stepped out of the office afterward and paused on the sidewalk without knowing whether to speak. The cold air had pressed against us, our breaths dissolving in quick white puffs. We did not reach for each other. We did not promise friendship or future kindness. We simply turned in opposite directions, allowing the city's noise to absorb the final traces of our shared chapter. It had been a clean end, not warm but not cruel, and in the years since, I had often been grateful for its simplicity. That version of him, quiet, distant, finished, was the version I expected to remain sealed in memory. Reaching the front of the chapel forced me back into the present. I paused only a few feet from him and took in the details that distance had hidden. His face carried a few new lines, subtle but unmistakable, and there was a faint weariness around his eyes that had not been there during our marriage. Yet he seemed more grounded than I remembered, as though time had settled him rather than hollowed him out. Despite these changes, something else drew my attention more strongly, something that did not align with the circumstances or the strangeness of his presence. It lived in his expression, quiet but unmistakable, a complexity of emotion that unsettled me even before I fully understood it. His eyes held the truth first. I had prepared myself for the possibility of resentment or jealousy, the predictable discomfort that might surface when crossing paths with someone who once held your heart. Instead, I found none of those things. His gaze held no accusation, no bitterness, no regret sharpened into defensiveness. What I saw was a softer, deeper expression, one that carried the weight of something he had brought with him. It was not longing, nor was it affection. It was an apology of a peculiar kind, one that seemed directed not at the past we shared but at the moment we now stood in. The apology did not feel manipulative or sentimental. It felt like a burden waiting to be spoken. The chapel's atmosphere thickened around us as if the room were listening. The music continued in a slow, controlled rhythm, but it sounded distant, almost irrelevant. The guests had grown unusually still, their earlier whispers fading into a watchful silence that made every small movement more noticeable. I could hear the subtle creak of a pew, the quiet shifting of fabric, and my own heartbeat pressing insistently against my ribs. My gaze flicked again toward the door at the back of the chapel, half expecting my fiancé to appear with the kind of explanation that unravels tension rather than deepens it. The doorway remained empty, the curtain unmoved by even the slightest breath of air. My question emerged before I consciously formed it. I asked where he was, my voice steady but carrying a tightness that felt unfamiliar. The question hung between us for only a moment before my ex-husband answered instead. He said that my fiancé had seemed nervous, that he had stepped outside to call someone, and that it would only be a minute. His tone was measured and careful, but beneath the surface, there was something strained, an effort to manage the truth rather than reveal it. His explanation offered no comfort, only more tension, and the apology in his eyes seemed to grow heavier with each word he spoke. I felt a shift inside me, subtle but undeniable. A new awareness rose in the space where certainty once lived. Something about his presence, his expression, and the timing of his arrival began to form a pattern I could not yet name. The image of my children's empty seats returned with new intensity, reminding me of their trembling voices from the night before. Their refusal had felt emotional then. Now it felt connected to something larger. My ex-husband's fingers tightened slightly as he spoke, a faint tremor betraying the calm he was trying to hold. The chapel's silence deepened in a way that almost felt deliberate. As though the walls themselves leaned inward to listen, I could sense that the guests felt the shift as well, though they could not see its shape. My ex-husband drew a careful breath and lowered his voice even further. He said he had not come to cause a disruption but because the children had called him the night before. The words landed heavily, settling into the center of my chest like a stone dropped into still water. In his tone, I heard the beginning of something difficult, something that did not yet have form but carried the unmistakable weight of consequence. In that moment, standing between the altar and the unanswered questions gathering like shadows at the edges of the room, one truth pressed through the uncertainty with quiet force. Whatever he had come here to say was not small, not casual, and not something that could coexist peacefully with the wedding I had planned. The look in his eyes told me there was more, and that the next words leaving his mouth had the power to reshape everything I thought I understood about this day. The moment stretched uncomfortably as I stood facing my ex-husband, trying to decipher the urgency behind his expression, when the chapel door suddenly pushed open with a soft burst of movement. A man hurried inside, his face flushed, his breath unsteady, and he leaned toward the officiant before anyone could question him. His words were hushed but carried enough weight to still the room. He whispered that the back door of the chapel was wide open and that my fiancé was nowhere outside. The message rippled through the guests in a subtle wave of shifting bodies, murmured confusion, and uneasy glances. A few people turned in their seats, craning to see whether someone else would appear with a more comforting explanation, but the silence following the announcement grew thick and restless. I felt a cold thread of unease coil inside my chest as the implications filtered through the haze of the moment. My fiancé stepping outside to make a call had seemed unusual but not alarming. Now it felt like a gap in the day that had expanded into something more unsettling. My mind tried to make sense of it, searching for reasonable explanations. A moment of nerves, a private conversation, a misunderstanding. But the back door being wide open carried a different tone, one that did not align with a simple break or a quiet moment alone. It introduced the possibility of absence with intention, and the thought sent a dull pressure through my ribs. I looked toward the rear of the chapel again, feeling the weight of its emptiness settle like a warning, before I could take a step or ask anyone to verify the situation more clearly. My ex-husband moved toward me with a deliberate, restrained urgency. He kept his voice low, but the strain within it was sharper now, cutting through the layers of confusion gathering in the room. He told me we needed to talk, not later, not after the ceremony, but now. His tone held an insistence I had not heard from him in years, not during the unraveling of our marriage, not during the divorce, not even during the rare disagreements that followed. It carried something heavier, something that refused to wait for the timing I wanted to protect. His eyes held that same weight, a mixture of tension and determination that drew my attention even as my mind resisted. I stiffened instinctively, pressing the bouquet closer to my chest as if it offered some form of grounding. I told him this was neither the time nor the place, that whatever he wanted to say could wait until the ceremony was over. The words came out calm but tight, shaped by the desperate attempt to cling to whatever order remained. It was my wedding day, or it was supposed to be, and the thought of stepping into a side conversation with my ex-husband felt like an impossible disruption. I felt the eyes of guests brushing the back of my dress like quiet intrusions, their curiosity as sharp as it was unspoken. The chapel was already leaning into disorder, and I wanted to pull everything back into a shape that resembled what I had planned. But he shook his head, barely moving, the gesture almost imperceptible yet unmistakably firm. There was something in his expression that mismatched everything I thought I understood about him. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't jealousy, it wasn't a desire to interfere. It was alarm, quiet, controlled, but undeniably present. He told me that whatever I believed could wait would not survive waiting. His voice carried a strain that reached deeper than frustration. It held the kind of tension that comes from carrying information too heavy to contain. And for the first time since the ceremony began, I saw a vulnerability behind his composure, an urgency tied not to emotion but to responsibility. I felt myself pulled between two instincts with equal force. The first urged me to maintain order, to insist on normalcy, to protect the framework of the day I had built with such fragile hope. The other, quieter but sharper, urged me to listen. It reminded me of the empty seats where my children should have been, of the tremble in their voices the night before, of the unanswered question lingering behind their refusal. It reminded me that this day had already fractured at its edges long before the back door stood open. My ex-husband's presence, his expression, his strained voice, all of it created a pattern that was beginning to connect in ways I did not yet understand. Something inside me shifted, hesitant but perceptive, acknowledging that the pieces forming before me did not belong to coincidence. The guests continued to adjust in their seats, some whispering quietly to one another, others watching with barely concealed concern. The chapel's atmosphere had changed entirely, losing the softness and anticipation that had shaped it minutes earlier. In its place settled a dense quiet filled with speculation and discomfort. The music playing in the background no longer felt gentle. It felt like a thread struggling to hold the room together. I could sense the collective unease, as if everyone recognized that something beneath the surface had begun to slip. The tension pressed closer, thickening the air. I turned my attention fully to my ex-husband, studying the lines of his face, the way his shoulders held tension beneath the fabric of his jacket, the faint tremor he was barely suppressing. His eyes had softened in a way that contrasted the strain in his voice. It wasn't softness born from emotion, it was softness born from honesty. It was the expression of someone who knew he was about to change the direction of the day and hated that responsibility but carried it anyway. I asked him what he needed to say, though the words tasted uncertain as they left my mouth. I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared, but readiness no longer seemed relevant in the shifting landscape of the moment. He hesitated only briefly, searching my face as if gauging whether I was strong enough to hear what he had brought with him. The hesitation felt protective rather than doubtful. When he finally spoke, he did so with a careful, steadying breath. He said he didn't believe my fiancé had simply stepped outside to make a call. He said the back door being open was not something to overlook, and he said that when the children had called him the night before, their voices carried fear strong enough to reach him even through the static of distance. The words landed inside me with slow, deliberate weight, settling into the space created by the unraveling of the morning. A chill moved through me, anchored by his final statement that the back door had not just been opened, but used, and in that moment, I understood that the day had shifted into a truth I could no longer avoid. The weight of my ex-husband's words settled over me with a heaviness that felt both foreign and familiar, as if part of me had been expecting something to tilt the balance of the day, though I had never imagined it would begin with the mention of our children. He took a careful breath, the kind a person takes when stepping onto fragile ground, and said they had called him the night before. The sentence alone struck me with enough force to still the room inside my mind. Our children had not reached out to him in years, not beyond what was required for logistics or polite acknowledgement. Their relationship with him had thinned quietly over time, shaped by distance and the quiet discomfort that followed the divorce. The idea that they had called him on the eve of my wedding felt like a thread pulled from a fabric I thought was stable, revealing a new and unexpected looseness beneath. He explained that the call had come late, long after he expected them to be asleep. He said their voices sounded different, strained, uncertain, carrying an emotional tremor that did not match simple reluctance or teenage resistance. As he relayed this, I felt a faint tightening in my stomach, a slow and unsteady pressure that grew as I tried to make sense of the contradiction. My children had spoken to me the previous night as well, though their tone had been muted, subdued, and marked by an unease I had brushed aside as nerves. I had interpreted their hesitation as discomfort with change, with seeing their mother begin a new life separate from the remnants of the old one. I had not imagined fear. The word itself created a hollow space inside my chest, one that deepened as my ex-husband continued. He told me that they had asked him a simple but startling request, to be at the chapel just in case. Something both vague and deeply serious. Just in case of what? Their phrasing hadn't contained accusation or panic, he said, but something more fragile, as if they were trying to express a concern they could feel but could not articulate. He described the tremor in their voices, one that had lingered even after they tried to steady themselves. As he spoke, his own voice carried an emotional seam he didn't try to hide. He wasn't embellishing, wasn't attempting to dramatize their words. He was relaying them with an honesty shaped by worry rather than motive. I tried to dismiss what he was saying with logic that felt increasingly thin. I told him quietly that perhaps they were simply uncomfortable with the wedding, that loyalty conflicts sometimes created complicated feelings for children, especially as they grew older. I suggested that maybe they had reached out to him because they didn't want to disappoint me directly, but even as I spoke these explanations aloud, they sounded like rehearsed reassurances rather than truths. He listened to me with patience, not pushing back but allowing the space for my rationalizations to unravel in their own time. His eyes, however, remained steady, watching me with a concern that carried no hint of manipulation or emotional leverage. The earnest tremor in his tone disarmed me more than his words themselves. It was a quality I had rarely heard from him, even when we had fought or when our marriage had begun to dissolve. His voice usually held a quiet certainty, even in moments of tension. But now, beneath the steadiness, there was a thin thread of urgency woven into his sentences, a thread that suggested he was not speculating but responding to something real he had sensed. I found myself studying his expression more carefully, the subtle furrow of his brow, the way his shoulders held an unfamiliar tension, and the faint crease at the corner of his mouth that appeared only when he was trying to choose his words carefully. A part of me clung tightly to the instinct to protect the structure of the day, to believe that the children's concerns were misplaced or exaggerated, that the interruption unfolding around me was only temporary and would resolve once my fiancé returned from wherever he had stepped. away, yet this instinct pressed against another part of me, one shaped by a mother's intuition rather than hope. I replayed my last conversation with the kids, the way they had spoken softly, hesitated at the end of sentences, and offered goodnight in a tone that carried more weight than the simple words implied. I had been too focused on calming their emotions to listen for what they had not said. The sweetness in their voices, something I had mistaken for tenderness, now felt like the mask they used to cover uncertainty. As my ex-husband continued speaking, he admitted he had not slept well after their call. He had spent the night questioning whether he should intervene or whether showing up unannounced would create unnecessary tension. He had considered calling me directly, but the children had asked him not to, not out of secrecy but because they didn't want to add stress to my wedding day. They wanted him there quietly, on the sidelines, not to interfere but to be present as a safeguard. That detail tightened the space around my heart. My children, who had been drifting emotionally for so long, had reached back toward a parent they rarely confided in. They had chosen him because they needed safety, not sentiment. The chapel around us seemed to fade into a muted blur, its soft music and hushed conversations receding beneath the pressure of everything he was revealing. I tried to focus on the details, to gather them into a coherent shape, but they remained scattered pieces that refused to connect fully. The back door left open, my fiancé's unexplained absence, my children's trembling voices, my ex-husband's sudden presence, all of it created a kind of slow, spiraling uncertainty that felt like the beginning of a truth I wasn't ready to name. He ended with a quiet statement that settled into the core of me with more weight than any of his explanations. He said he wasn't asking me to assume anything or to panic. He only needed me to understand that our children had not been nervous or conflicted, they had been afraid. The earnestness in his voice removed any remaining space for denial, and though I did not yet know what they feared, or why it had led them to seek him out after years of distance, one question rose with unmistakable clarity. What had my children seen that I had missed? The moment my ex-husband finished speaking, a pressure settled over my lungs that made it difficult to stand still in the center of the chapel. The guests were shifting uneasily, sensing the tension even if they did not understand its shape, and I felt the walls beginning to close around the edges of my awareness. I quietly excused myself and walked toward the small bridal room tucked behind the front pews, needing space to breathe and clarity that the chapel no longer offered. My dress brushed softly against the wooden floor, the sound muted beneath the low hum of whispers drifting behind me. When I reached the door and stepped inside, the quiet wrapped around me with a weight that felt both relieving and suffocating, as if the silence itself held questions I had avoided for far too long. I pulled out my phone with hands that were steadier than I expected, though the steadiness felt forced, a reflexive effort to preserve order in a moment that was unraveling by the minute. I pressed my daughter's name first, listening to the ring echo through the room in a long, repetitive loop that grew more hollow with each passing second. When the call went unanswered, I immediately tried my son, hoping his voice would break through the unease tightening inside me. His phone also rang endlessly, the rhythm of it creating a slow, persistent ache beneath my ribs. I tried them both again, alternating between their names as the seconds thickened into minutes. But the outcome remained the same: no answer, no voicemail, no abrupt decline indicating they were busy or distracted. Only the empty ringing that carried a subtle note of distance I could not ignore. Behind me, the door remained open just enough for me to sense my ex-husband standing a few feet away in the hallway. He did not enter the room and did not call my name. He stayed at a respectful distance, his presence steady but unobtrusive, as though he was trying to honor every boundary I had once drawn so sharply between us. I could hear his careful breathing, the kind that signaled concern without pressing into panic. His restraint struck me deeply because I knew how easily he could have stepped in, tried to take control, or pushed his own interpretations onto the moment. Instead, he waited. He allowed me space to attempt my own clarity. Even if the clarity remained stubbornly out of reach, I lowered my phone slowly, staring at the screen as if it might shift into a different truth if I waited long enough. My chest tightened with a slow realization that carried more confusion than fear. My children were not simply unavailable. They were unreachable in a way that felt deliberate or disrupted, something that did not match their personalities or their routines. As I scrolled through my notifications, hoping for a missed call or a message that would explain their silence, I saw something I had overlooked earlier in my haste to focus on the ceremony. It was a small, unread audio message from my daughter, sent early that morning, at a time when I assumed she had been asleep. The timestamp made my heart thud once hard and hollow, as if recognizing something before my mind caught up. I tapped the message, holding the phone close, expecting it to be a simple reassurance or perhaps a quiet expression of support. Instead, the audio opened with a rush of sound that made it difficult to interpret anything clearly. There was wind, or perhaps static, a kind of low, wavering noise that wove around a voice I could not fully hear. Someone was speaking in the background, but the words were muffled, distorted enough that I could not distinguish tone or meaning. My daughter's breathing was audible, soft but uneven, as if she were trying to stay quiet or hide the phone while recording. The mixture of noise and silence created an atmosphere that felt unsettlingly familiar, like the uneasy stillness before someone confesses something they fear will not be believed. As the audio continued, her voice emerged in a whisper that felt too close, too fragile, and shaped by a tension I had not heard from her in years. She said, "Mom, are you sure?" The question cut through the static with startling clarity, landing with a weight that pressed against the center of my chest. It was not the casual uncertainty of a teenager or the reluctant hesitation of someone resisting change. It was the kind of question that carried worry shaped by observation, by something unseen but deeply felt. The recording ended abruptly after those four words, cutting off mid-breath as though she had turned the phone away or silenced it before someone else could hear. I replayed the recording immediately, trying to catch any variation in the background noise that might reveal who she was speaking near or what she had been responding to. The static softened in some moments, grew harsher in others, but never clarified the voice behind it or the environment she was in. It sounded neither indoors nor fully outside, like a transitional space, a porch, a hallway, an open door. I strained to move past the muffled layers, to isolate meaning from the echoes, but the sound remained stubbornly ambiguous. My daughter's whisper, though brief, carried enough emotional depth to stay lodged in my mind, reshaping everything I had assumed about the morning. As I stood there, staring at the fading waveform on my screen, the realization crept in with a slow, uneasy certainty that my daughter had not been asking about the wedding itself. She had not been asking whether I was sure about the day, the dress, or the man waiting at the altar. Her question had carried a tremble that suggested she meant something far more personal and urgent, something tied to whatever she and her brother had sensed the night before. The recording did not give me answers, but it illuminated a void, a gap where understanding should have been, and that void grew with every unanswered call and every detail that refused to align. I raised my eyes toward the doorway, where my ex-husband still stood silently. His expression had changed subtly. There was more concern now, a deeper crease in his brow, and a quiet acknowledgement that hung in the air between us, without stepping inside. He asked gently if they had answered. I shook my head slowly, unable to shape the words just yet, overwhelmed by the implications woven into their silence. The chapel had felt heavy before, but now the weight expanded into something more diffuse and personal, stretching beyond the walls and into the unknown spaces where my children should have been within reach. As I looked down at my phone once more, replaying the last second of the audio in my mind, one question pressed itself into my awareness with a tension that would not ease. What had my daughter heard before she pressed record, and what had she wanted me to understand in the question she had whispered so carefully? The silence that followed her message felt more telling than the recording itself. A silence that hinted at the possibility that the back door, the missing groom, and my children's fear were tangled strands of a truth I was only beginning to see. I had barely finished replaying the audio message in my mind when a shadow moved across the doorway, followed by the abrupt sound of hurried footsteps. My fiancé appeared in the hall outside the bridal room, breathless and noticeably pale, as though he had been running or had encountered something he was not prepared to face. His hand rested against the doorframe for a moment, steadying himself before stepping inside. The first thing I noticed was the sheen of sweat clinging to his collar despite the cool air circulating. Rough the chapel, it was unusual enough to make my pulse stutter, especially given how composed he typically tried to appear. He offered me a strained smile that did not reach his eyes, and the tension in his jaw suggested he was trying to maintain calm rather than genuinely feeling it. He said he had stepped outside to make a call, repeating the same explanation the officiant had provided earlier, but his voice carried an uncharacteristic tremor beneath the surface. The tremor was small, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know him intimately, but I felt it immediately. It slipped into the space between his words, giving them a subtle, hurried quality that did not match the reassurance he was trying to convey. I studied him more closely, taking in the uneven rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers tapped against his thigh as if he were fighting to remain still, and the faint, unexpected redness beneath his eyes. Something about him seemed brittle, like a fawade struggling to maintain form under too much pressure. Behind him, my ex-husband had not moved from his place in the hallway. He stood with a posture that was both attentive and restrained, neither entering fully nor stepping away. The contrast between the two men created a tension that filled the narrow space between them. My ex-husband's gaze followed every shift in my fiancé's stance with narrowed eyes, not confrontational but alert, as though he were quietly evaluating each breath, each hesitation, each choice of words. It reminded me of the way he used to watch for signs of a storm on long drives, noticing subtle changes in the landscape before anyone else recognized the shift in weather. His presence steadied me even as it complicated the moment. The air felt heavier in the confined space, carrying a dense quietness that magnified the smallest sounds, the rustle of fabric as my fiancé adjusted his jacket, the faint scrape of my shoe against the floor, and the slow exhale from my ex-husband that seemed to cut through the tension like a whisper. I became uncomfortably aware of the pressure building around us, a pressure that felt less like anticipation and more like a truth waiting to be forced into the open. My fiancé moved further into the room and reached for my hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed against mine. The gesture, usually tender, now felt hurried and uncertain, as if he feared losing his place beside me. I hesitated, not out of rejection but because the contact felt wrong and steady in a way that unsettled me deeper than I wanted to admit. I searched his face, hoping to find reassurance or an explanation that would ease the alarm growing beneath my ribs. Instead, I found an expression that looked carefully constructed, the kind a person wears when trying to hide something they cannot control. His smile wavered slightly, and the moment it faltered, something fragile slipped through the surface, a flicker of panic, quickly buried but unmistakable. That single crack in his composure reached through the air and tightened the space between us even further. He asked if I was all right, his voice softer now but still carrying that trembling note. I answered slowly, telling him I was concerned because he had been gone longer than expected, and because someone had mentioned the back door being left open. He nodded quickly, too quickly, insisting it was nothing, that he simply needed a moment of air, that he hadn't realized how overwhelming the day would feel. His explanations came in a stream of loosely connected sentences, spoken faster than usual and marked by hurried glances toward the hallway where my ex-husband stood. It was clear he felt watched, judged, or perhaps exposed, though my ex-husband had not spoken a word. As I listened to him, a part of me tried to extend understanding. Weddings were emotional. Nerves were natural. Stress could easily distort someone's demeanor, but there was something offbeat about his tone, something mismatched between his words and his expression. He kept insisting he was fine, but his body told a different story. The stiff set of his shoulders, the restless movement of his hands, the faint twitch beneath his left eye when I mentioned the children not answering their phones. It wasn't typical nerves, it was strain, tightly held and difficult to conceal. I glanced toward my ex-husband again, hoping he might offer a signal or explanation, but his expression remained unreadable. The crease between his brows deepened as he studied my fiancé, and for a moment, their eyes met. The exchange was brief but charged, a silent assessment that made the air shift. My ex-husband's jaw tightened slightly, and though he said nothing, the message behind his posture was clear. He was waiting for something, not in a hopeful way, but in the manner of someone expecting a truth to surface on its own. The tension created by his quiet watchfulness made the room feel smaller, as though the walls had drawn closer without physically moving. I felt caught between the two men, one holding a secret he did not want to reveal, and the other carrying a concern he did not yet dare to share fully. The energy between them created a subtle but undeniable pull at the edges of my awareness, urging me to look past the surface of the moment and into the spaces where intention and reality did not align. My fiancé's hand tightened around mine, his grip unsteady. He asked if we could go back to the chapel, resume the ceremony, continue as planned. The urgency in his request felt misplaced, almost unnatural, and it pressed against the unease that had been building within me since the morning began. My hesitation grew heavier as I pulled my hand back slowly, gently, giving myself space to breathe. His eyes flickered with something like apprehension, a reaction that sent a fresh wave of discomfort through me. My ex-husband took a measured step forward, still silent. But the shift in his stance signaled a readiness I had not seen from him in years. He was watching my fiancée with the caution of someone expecting the truth to crack open under its own pressure, and his vigilance both frightened and steadied me simultaneously. As the silence thickened between the three of us, one unsettling realization tightened around my heart. Whatever truth existed beneath the surface of this moment was closer than any of us wanted to admit. And my ex-husband seemed prepared for the moment it finally broke through. The tension in the hallway had already grown into something dense and unwieldy, but it thickened further when my ex-husband stepped closer with a measured, deliberate movement. His expression carried the same cautious urgency I had noticed earlier, yet now it held something more personal, a quiet conflict, as though he was wrestling with whether or not he should reveal what he was holding. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small, folded piece of paper, worn at the edges and creased from being handled more than once. When he offered it to me, his fingers lingered just long enough for me to sense the gravity of the moment, a silent acknowledgement that whatever lived inside that paper could not be dismissed easily. I accepted it reluctantly, my heart beating unevenly as I unfolded it. The paper felt soft beneath my fingertips, thin slightly in places as if someone had held it too tightly, and the pen strokes across its surface were familiar enough to stop my breath for a beat. My daughter's handwriting stared up at me, unmistakable in its careful curves and uneven slant, the result of years spent trying to perfect her letters. There were only 2 lines written, but they were enough to shift something fundamental inside me. Mom doesn't see it. Don't let her marry him. The message was brief, hurried, and shaped by a fear that seeped through every letter. My stomach tightened with a slow, sinking ache as I read the note again, hoping the meaning would change or soften on the second pass. It didn't. Instead, the words grew heavier, expanding into a quiet dread that pressed against my ribs. I looked up at my ex-husband, searching for context, explanation, anything that might ground me. He watched me with a mixture of sadness and restraint, as though he wished the message were less severe but knew he could not shield me from it. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the truth of someone who had not wanted the burden but could not ignore it. Before I could process his explanation, my fiancé moved forward quickly, reaching for the note with a frustrated urgency that felt sharp rather than concerned. He insisted the message was a misunderstanding, that my children had been distant and unpredictable for months, and that this was simply another attempt to manipulate the situation. His voice rose slightly, though he tried to restrain himself, and the defensiveness beneath his words clashed loudly with the fragile quietness of the note in my hands. He said my daughter was jealous, that she felt threatened by the shift in our family dynamic, and that she was inventing fears because she couldn't accept change. As he spoke, he attempted to offer reassurances that sounded more like rehearsed excuses, a string of claims that did not align with the trembling handwriting on the paper. His explanations came too quickly, delivered with a force that seemed designed to cover the cracks rather than reveal the truth. And each sentence felt increasingly hollow against the weight of what I was holding. I listened to him carefully, wanting desperately to believe that his version of the story was the truth. But a part of me that had been quiet until now began to stir. It was the part shaped by motherhood, by years of listening to my children's unspoken emotions, by recognizing when their silence meant more than their words. The note in my hand felt fragile, yet it carried an unmistakable urgency that did not match the narrative my fiancé was trying to push. My daughter was many things: sensitive, thoughtful, slow to speak, but she was not manipulative. She was not reckless with her emotions, nor was she prone to dramatic warnings. The idea that she would write something this severe without genuine cause felt incompatible with everything I knew about her. As these thoughts formed, my ex-husband remained silent but steady beside me, his presence neither confrontational nor passive. His gaze flicked toward my fiancé with a restraint that suggested he was holding back more than he wished to reveal in front of him. The longer my fiancé spoke, the more his tone shifted from defense to agitation, and his attempts to dismiss the message grew increasingly forced. He accused my ex-husband of influencing the children, of planting ideas that would damage our future, and of using the moment to undermine what he called progress. The accusations came quickly, but they lacked precision, like someone trying to throw blame at anything within reach rather than addressing the note itself. His voice grew tighter as he spoke, and it became clear that the calm composure he had displayed earlier was slipping beyond his control. I felt the room constrict with the intensity of his words, and the atmosphere shifted into something sharper and less forgiving. His explanations no longer felt like attempts to protect me, they felt like attempts to protect himself. And the realization sank into me with a cold clarity that surprised me with its depth. As he continued, I folded the note back into its original shape, my fingers lingering on the edges as though trying to absorb every detail of it. The message carried an emotional weight that overshadowed every rational argument my fiancé attempted to present. My mind replayed the audio message from my daughter, her whisper asking, "Mom, are you sure?" The tone of that question, combined with the handwritten warning now trembling slightly between my fingers, formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. My children had seen something, felt something that I had overlooked. The truth of that realization pressed into me slowly, carving space for a concern that was no longer abstract but painfully specific. I felt a tremor move through my hands, one that came not from fear alone but from the recognition that a truth had been staring at me longer than I wanted to admit. My ex-husband took a careful step closer, not intruding but offering presence, a subtle signal that he was prepared to support me through whatever understanding was beginning to surface. His voice, when it finally broke through the growing tension, was quiet and steady. He reminded me that our children were not dramatic by nature, that they rarely expressed fear without reason, and that they had never reached out to him unless they felt genuinely unsettled. His words carried no personal motive, no attempt to sway me. They were rooted in the shared knowledge of who our children were. The stability in his tone contrasted starkly with the rising defensiveness in my fiancé's voice, and the difference between them settled into my awareness with undeniable clarity. As I stood between the two men, holding a note that felt heavier than paper should ever feel, one truth began to crystallize inside me with a quiet, unwavering certainty. Whatever my children had sensed, whatever had prompted them to write these words and send that whispered message, was real. And the more my fiancé tried to dismiss their fear, the more his explanations unraveled beneath the weight of what I already knew in my heart. The question that lingered at the edges of my awareness grew sharper, more defined, and impossible to push away. What had my children seen that I had been too blinded or too willing to overlook? The note still rested in my hand when my ex-husband exhaled slowly, a sound so controlled it almost blended into the background noise of the hallway. The tension between us had settled into something quiet but undeniably heavy, as if the truth we were circling had finally begun to take shape in the air around us. My fiancé had retreated a step, clearly unsettled by the direction of the conversation, but my ex-husband's gaze remained steady, focusing not on him, but on me with an expression that carried both apology and inevitability. It was then that he finally spoke in a low voice, confessing that he had sensed something off about my fiancé long before today, that it had been a subtle knowing he hadn't trusted himself to acknowledge fully. His confession was not delivered with pride or satisfaction. It came wrapped in the unease of someone who had carried doubt too quietly and for too long. He explained that months earlier, during one of the brief exchanges we occasionally had while coordinating schedules for the children, my fiancé had told him a story that didn't align with something I had mentioned. At the time, my ex-husband hadn't thought much of it, assuming it was a misunderstanding, the kind that happens when communication wavers between households. But the inconsistency had lodged itself in his mind, not sharp enough to raise alarm but noticeable enough to linger. Over the next few weeks, he noticed similar moments, small details that changed shape depending on who was asking, explanations that seemed polished on the surface but slightly unsteady underneath. He said the lies weren't traditional lies, not bold or obvious. They were the kind of distortions that hid beneath the tone of confidence, the kind that only reveal themselves to someone paying close attention. As he spoke, I felt a quiet shiver slip beneath my skin, moving with a slow certainty that made me painfully aware of how familiar these observations felt. I remembered subtle shifts in my fiancé's stories, minor details that had never matched exactly when repeated. I remembered the way he assured me of things too quickly, before I had even finished asking. I remembered nights where I had sensed something tense beneath his calmness but convinced myself it was stress, exhaustion, anything but dishonesty. Those moments had been small enough to dismiss, easy enough to smooth over with explanations I supplied for him. Explanations formed out of the loneliness I carried and the hope I was desperate to protect. Hearing my ex-husband describe similar experiences forced a clarity I had been resisting for months. He looked down briefly, as though disappointed in himself, and admitted that he had kept silent because he did not want to seem jealous or intrusive, especially after everything that had unfolded between us. He said he didn't want to create tension where none might truly exist, and he feared burdening me with concerns he couldn't fully articulate. The confession felt genuine, not shaped by ego but by caution, and the restraint in his voice reflected the complicated history that bound us. For years, he had taken care not to interfere in my life unless necessary, keeping a respectful distance even when the boundaries between us felt unnecessarily wide. The acknowledgement that he had sensed these inconsistencies but hesitated to speak reopened an old tenderness between us, not romantic but rooted in shared responsibility and the strange, enduring connection of parenthood. I felt a cold realization slide through me, settling behind my ribs with a steady, unwelcome certainty. I, too, had noticed small things, subtle things that had pulsed with the faint rhythm of unease. But I had chosen not to follow those instincts, not to examine the edges where truth began to fray. I had ignored the hesitation in my daughter's voice, the questions my son asked that felt too careful, the moments where my fiancé seemed overly prepared for explanations I hadn't requested. I had painted over my doubts with hope and brushed aside my intuition with the misguided belief that love, especially a second chance at love, meant giving wide margins for human flaws. Now those margins looked more like blind spots than compassion. The silence between us deepened, and the weight of the unspoken truths pressed more firmly into the small room. Outside, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, its distant echo slipping through the thin walls of the chapel. The sound carried an eerie, atmospheric quality, as if the sky itself were wrestling with something heavy and unresolved. The air inside felt charged, not with fear exactly, but with the tension that precedes change, the kind that forces movement even when stillness feels safer. The storm was still far off, but the atmosphere had already shifted, tightening around us like a quiet warning that time was no longer ours to waste. My fiancé remained silent now, his earlier defensiveness replaced by something far less decipherable. His expression had tightened, his eyes darting between me and my ex-husband with a sharpness he tried and failed to conceal. He looked like someone expecting a confrontation but hoping it would dissolve on its own. The unease that flickered beneath his surface had grown more visible, threading through his posture and coloring his silence. I watched him closely, studying the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled inward slightly as if preparing to brace against whatever he feared might come next. It was not the silence of guilt necessarily, but the silence of someone holding something fragile, hoping it would not break. My ex-husband shifted slightly, releasing a slow breath that seemed to cut through the layers of tension. He said quietly that sometimes the truths we ignore do not fade. They grow sharper with time, returning with edges we can no longer overlook. His words were neither accusatory nor triumphant. They carried the sober tone of someone speaking from experience, someone who knew intimately the danger of overlooking small inconsistencies until they became patterns too large to deny. Hearing him say this struck a chord deep within me, echoing against the truths I had buried beneath hope and loneliness. I looked down at my hands, still holding my daughter's note, the paper trembling slightly between my fingers. The fear etched into those words, combined with the inconsistencies my ex-husband had witnessed and the unease I had buried, formed a mosaic that pointed to a truth both painful and necessary. I realized then that the storm gathering outside might as well have been gathering inside me all along, each rumble of thunder mirroring the quiet collapse of the narrative I had tried so hard to build. As the thunder echoed again, rolling through the mountains like a question too large to ignore, one thought rose with unmistakable clarity. The truths we push aside do not disappear, they wait patiently in the corners of our lives, returning with sharper edges when we can least afford to ignore them. Walking back into the chapel felt like stepping into a room that had held its breath for too long. The air had shifted since I had last stood there, gaining a heaviness that made each step feel deliberate and weighted. My fiancé stood at the altar, rigid and tense, his posture so unnaturally straight that it seemed as though he were bracing against an invisible force. His jaw was set tightly, and though he tried to mask his unease with a practiced expression, the stiffness around his eyes told a different story. The guests had rearranged themselves into a collective stillness. Some pretended to look away while others allowed their curiosity to settle openly on us. Their hushed murmurs clung to the room's edges, creating a subtle tension that pulsed beneath the fading music. I felt their stares but refused to let them shape my pace. I walked slowly down the aisle, not with anger or accusation, but with a clarity I had not felt in years. My ex-husband followed at a respectful distance, stepping into the chapel with quiet composure. He stayed near the wall, taking his place not as someone intervening, but as someone carrying out a promise one our children had entrusted him with. His presence felt steady, grounding in a way that steadied my breath even as the uncertainty before me grew larger. I sensed the guests watching the two of us, trying to decipher the dynamics they knew nothing about, but I kept my focus ahead. My fiancé's face flickered with relief when he saw me return, but the relief was superficial, the kind that surfaces briefly before sinking beneath deeper currents. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, a small tell that betrayed his effort to maintain control. As I approached the altar, I felt the echo of memories pressing against the walls of my mind, moments when I had ignored intuition for the sake of peace, moments when his charm had outweighed my unease, moments when I had convinced myself that small inconsistencies were simply misunderstandings rather than warnings. Those memories gathered quietly behind me, forming a soft but persistent chorus that accompanied my steps. My heart beat steadily, no longer frantic or uncertain, but anchored in something that resembled truth. When I finally reached the front of the chapel, the distance between us held more weight than any aisle could contain. I looked at him, truly looked, peeling away the layers of explanations he had given, the reassurances he had offered, and the stories he had told with such practiced ease. He reached for my hand again, but I pulled mine gently back before he could touch it. The gesture did not rise from anger. It was a boundary shaped by realization. His hand hovered in the air for a moment before he lowered it slowly, and in that brief hesitation, I saw a flicker of something vulnerable mixed with something defensive. The combination unsettled me more than any lie could have. His eyes searched my face with an intensity that seemed to ask for forgiveness before truth had even been spoken. I held his gaze, not offering comfort or blame, but holding space for the question I had carried with me for months, the one that had lingered at the edges of my mind without ever forming into words. The chapel grew quieter as I drew in a steady breath, preparing to ask the question that had waited silently beneath my certainty. My voice, when it emerged, was soft and controlled, shaped by the calm that comes only after fear has settled. I asked him where he had really gone when he stepped outside, and why the back door had been left open behind him. I asked him why my children were afraid, and why their voices trembled in ways I had never heard before. But beneath all those threads lay the question that mattered most, the one that had pressed against my heart every time his stories shifted slightly or his explanations arrived too quickly. It was the question I had not allowed myself to confront until the moment demanded it. I asked him what truth he had been hiding from me. The silence that followed stretched long enough for a faint rumble of thunder outside to fill the space. He refused to answer. His eyes darted briefly toward my ex-husband, then toward the guests, then back to me, as though he were searching for an escape route that didn't exist. His mouth opened, but the explanation that emerged was not solid. It was fractured, shaped by desperation rather than honesty. He claimed he had been overwhelmed, that he needed air, that the children misunderstood him, that everything had been blown out of proportion. But each word trembled beneath the weight of something unspoken, something large enough to distort the truth he was pretending to hold steady. I watched his expression shift, watched his composure unravel just enough to reveal what lay beneath. It wasn't one lie but many small ones, stacked carefully over time, forming a structure he had hoped would hold until vows replaced doubt. The tremor in his voice deepened, betraying the calm he tried to project. He insisted again that he loved me, that he wanted this marriage, that he had only stepped outside because he felt faint. Yet the story bent under its own fragility, unable to support the contradictions woven through it. The certainty I had once clung to dissolved quietly inside me, leaving behind a clarity that felt sharper than sorrow and steadier than anger. My ex-husband did not move, did not speak, did not interrupt. He stood at the edge of the chapel like a sentinel, carrying the silent understanding that truth revealed itself best without interference. His stillness offered a strange kind of reassurance, a reminder that some truths did not need volume to be heard. The storm outside continued to grumble, its echoes threading through the silence inside, creating a soundscape that felt both distant and intimately connected to the moment at hand. My fiancé's shoulders slumped as he realized the narrative he had held together was beginning to break apart beneath the pressure of questions he could no longer evade. I took another breath, steady and deep, letting the weight of the moment settle without rushing to fill it. The fragile thread of certainty I had nurtured throughout my relationship with him snapped quietly, not violently, but with the unmistakable sound of something ending. His explanations no longer reached me. They hovered in the air without meaning, failing to bridge the widening gap between us. The truth was not a single revelation but a culmination of patterns I had ignored, instincts I had silenced, and warnings my children had tried desperately to deliver. The collapse was not sudden, it had been forming for months. Today simply revealed what had been waiting to surface. As I stepped back from him, creating a space that felt final even without words of finality, the chapel held its breath with me. I looked at the man I had planned to marry and saw not a partner but a stranger shaped by omissions, contradictions, and the quiet erosion of trust. Whatever promise he had hoped to make at the altar now felt hollow, unsupported by the truth required to sustain it. I realized, with a slow and steady certainty, that a vow built upon uncertainty could never hold. And as the thunder rolled once more across the valley, I understood that the question was no longer whether he had lied, but what happens to a promise when the truth beneath it collapses entirely. Stepping away from the altar felt like separating from a version of myself that had been trying too hard to hold everything together. The heaviness that had settled in my chest throughout the morning began to lift with a slow, deliberate ease, like fog rising from a valley after a long and stubborn storm. The air inside the chapel changed subtly as I moved, its weight shifting from suffocating uncertainty to a strange lightness shaped by clarity rather than relief. My fiancé, no longer my fiancé, took one look at the distance I created and seemed to understand without needing further explanation. He did not try to defend himself again, did not attempt to plead, justify, or reclaim what had begun to crumble hours earlier. With a tight jaw and eyes that flickered with something unreadable, he simply turned toward the side door and left the chapel without speaking to anyone. His silence told me more than any confession possibly could, revealing an exhaustion or resignation that confirmed the truth beneath his earlier denials. The guests quietly shifted, their attention following him only long enough to acknowledge his departure before they lowered their gazes out of courtesy. The room gradually loosened as people rose from their seats in small clusters. Their movements carried a gentleness that felt almost reverent, as though they recognized the intimacy of the moment and understood instinctively that it was not theirs to dissect. They whispered soft goodbyes to one another, offered brief nods of sympathy in my direction, and drifted toward the exit with a calmness that surprised me. The departure felt less like a crowd dispersing after a cancelled ceremony and more like witnesses leaving the aftermath of a storm they had not expected to encounter. Their hushed footsteps faded with a dignity that allowed me to breathe without feeling observed or judged. I remained still for a long moment, standing in the aisle while the echoes of their departure softened into silence. Eventually, the chapel emptied until only two figures remained: my ex-husband and me. He stood near the wall, exactly where he had positioned himself earlier, as if uncertain whether he should move or remain still. His posture held respect, restraint, and a quiet awareness of the gravity in the room. I turned toward him not because I sought comfort or nostalgia, but because he had been the one constant presence throughout the unraveling of the day, the one who had chosen to stand where our children asked him to stand, even when it meant stepping back into a space that had once caused both of us pain. His eyes softened when our gazes met, reflecting a mixture of sorrow, relief, and something quieter that did not demand interpretation. I walked toward him with slow steps, each one loosening another remnants of the tension that had been lodged beneath my ribs. He did not move until I stopped in front of him, leaving enough space to preserve the boundaries we had learned to maintain over the years. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, carrying neither triumph nor validation, only the sincerity of someone who understood the magnitude of what had just transpired. He said he was sorry, not for attending, not for interfering, but for the fact that I had walked into a future that had been hiding shadows behind its promises. His apology was not meant to fix anything, and it didn't attempt to rewrite the day. It simply acknowledged the weight of what had been revealed and honored the role he had unexpectedly played. I thanked him quietly, not because I felt indebted to him, but because gratitude felt like the only honest response. What he had done today was not an act of reclaiming or rivalry. It was an act of responsibility rooted in the years we had shared as parents. For the first time in a long while, I looked at him not through the lens of our past mistakes or the ending of our marriage, but through the steadiness he had shown when our children needed him. It struck me then that the compass we had always shared, the one aligned with the well-being of our children, had remained intact even when everything else between us had fallen apart. That shared instinct, that quiet understanding, was still present and still guiding him. We walked together toward the front of the chapel, stopping a few feet from the altar where the lilies were beginning to droop slightly, their petals curling inward as if mimicking the fatigue that had threaded itself through the morning. The space felt less like a site of abandonment and more like a threshold that I had stepped away from just in time. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It carried the familiarity of people who had moved through difficult chapters together and learned how to exist alongside the complexity of shared history. We did not need to resurrect old conversations or dwell on mistakes that no longer held weight. Instead, we stood side by side, acknowledging the strange intersection of past and present that the day had unexpectedly forged. The thunder outside grew closer, rolling through the valley with a deep resonance that felt strangely fitting. It was not violent or foreboding, just assertive enough to remind us that storms rarely arrive without warning signs, even if the signs are ignored or misunderstood. The sound filled the empty space inside the chapel, harmonizing with the quiet reflection that had settled between us. I found myself breathing more deeply, letting the air reach places that had felt constricted for days, weeks, perhaps even months. The clarity that had emerged earlier continued to root itself in me, steady and undeniable. My ex-husband eventually turned toward me with a question in his eyes, one that asked if I was all right without requiring me to answer aloud. I nodded, offering a faint, tired smile that felt honest rather than forced. The exhaustion that crept through me was not from heartbreak, but from the weight of truth finally landing where it belonged. I realized then that I was mourning not the loss of a marriage that never began, but the version of myself who had ignored the quiet warnings, who had tried so hard to choose hope over instinct. That version deserved compassion, not judgment, and I allowed myself to feel it without shame. As we prepared to leave the chapel, I paused at the doorway and looked back one more time. The empty aisle, the scattered petals, the stillness of the altar, all of it felt transformed, less like a symbol of abandonment and more like a place where truth had finally surfaced. I wondered, with a softness I hadn't expected, whether my past had truly come back to haunt me or whether it had arrived to save me from something I had not been ready to face alone. The answer remained quiet, but it settled in the space between my steps as my ex-husband walked beside me, carrying nothing but the steady presence of someone who had done the right thing when it mattered most.